Now, years later, Robert Todd Lincoln was president of the Pullman Company. He would preside over the company for the next 14 years. One of Robert Todd's first actions was to make the Pullman monopoly complete. As the Pullman Company grew, other sleeping car operators were swept aside. By 1899, every company had been acquired but one, the Wagner Palace Car Company. Wagner was owned by one of the largest rail baron families in the United States, the powerful Vanderbilts. Wagner Palace cars were quite similar to Pullman cars in luxury and design. When Wagner incorporated the vestibule, or enclosed passageway between cars, it borrowed Pullman technology. Pullman sued Wagner for infringing on a patent. After a long legal battle, the Pullman Company defeated the mighty Vanderbilts and won the entire sleeping car business.
The Pullman Company now had created one of the largest monopolies in the history of the United States. So here was this gigantic enterprise with 10,000 sleeping cars, which now was considered the world's greatest hotel. Each night, almost 100,000 passengers would check into a Pullman car.
By the 1920s, more than 35 million passengers traveled in Pullman sleepers every year. The Pullman Company was not only the world's greatest hotel, it was the world's largest housekeeper. The company owned more than 4 million towels and 3.5 million sheets. It wasn't easy to supply constantly moving sleeping cars with clean linens. Sheets and towels were washed at 10 Pullman laundromats around the country. During 1 year, the company's laundry bill alone exceeded $3 million. To keep costs down, the Pullman Company became self-sufficient. The company manufactured many of its supplies. Pullman even had its own printing presses, spitting out tickets, time cards, and advertisements. The company was built to elegantly serve the masses, but it could also take care of the elite.
In the era before the private jet, the one reliable emblem of prestige and power in land transportation was the private railroad car. Pullman built, by all accounts, some of the most opulent and lavish private railroad cars ever to grace the rails of America.
The cars were a symbol of success. Executives, millionaires, even presidents traveled in custom-built, privately owned Pullman cars.
Pullman could do anything you wanted, limited only by your ability to pay and by your imagination. Accommodations for a staff of 1 or a group of 5 servants, Pullman could take care of you.
Businesses often chartered Pullman trains to take executives to an event or conference. Usually, the best of the Pullman staff worked on these exclusive trains. But the success of a passenger's trip often depended on one man, the Pullman porter.
From the moment that the passenger came up to the car, he greeted the people, he took their bags, he brought them up, he ushered them in, he showed them how the room worked, he waited on them hand and foot.
The Pullman porter became legendary, even heralded in song.
Just see those Pullman porters, dolled up with perfumed waters, but by their dimes and quarters, here they come, here they come, here they come.
You have to almost be a diplomat to be a good Pullman porter, because you got to learn what people like, what they dislike, and that's what they should get, because it helps the company and it helps you.
With a touch of a button, the porter would be at the passenger service.
I said, well, here's the bell, and my name is George, so if you need my service, just touch the bell, and I'll be at your service. I'm gone, leave them on. But then there are other people like to want you to hang around and talk. They tell jokes or listen to your jokes.
Whether making beds, shining shoes, or serving drinks, porters served their guests 24 hours a day. It was hard work, but for most porters, it was the best job available.
We know all the Pullman porters that lived in the neighborhoods, who lived a good life. A lot of them were buying their homes. All of them had cars. And they seemed to be different from the rest of the neighborhood. So we just set an image for us that we wanted to kind of be like them. Being black, you couldn't get decent jobs anyhow, you know. And that seemed to be the only, well, at that time, we thought it was a decent job.
Although porters were respected in their communities, they were often treated like second-class citizens at work.
There's an ad, a captain and his crew, and you have all these smiling black faces with the white conductor there. And what is that? That's the overseer and the slaves.
For porters, the struggle of better working conditions would take years. Their efforts would be led by a man who was labeled by the U.S. Attorney General the most dangerous Negro in America. Trains Unlimited will continue. In the 1920s, a new generation of African Americans was becoming Pullman porters. These men were different from the former slaves once hired by George Pullman in the early days of the fledgling company. They wanted more than a job. They wanted to be treated fairly. During its first 50 years of operation, the Pullman Company hired more African Americans than any other company. But almost all the jobs were as porters with no room for promotion.
That's as high as you could get. I don't care how much seniority you had and how well you were educated and how your performance was. You're going to be hired as a Pullman porter. If you worked 50 years, when you retired, you were still a Pullman porter.
Porters were often treated with little respect. Many passengers referred to them as George. Some say the name was coined from the phrase, George Pullman's boy.
I used to kind of get back at them in a nice way. I said, you called me right name this time because my name really is George.
One passenger named George Delaney got tired of hearing his name called continuously when traveling. He formed a club called the Society for the Prevention of Calling Sleeping Car Porters George. He enlisted over 30,000 members, including a sergeant-at-arms named George Herman Ruth.
We learned to accept George. I mean, George was just call you George. I've been called that other word, too.
Porters were also forced to always wear a smile.
I was called to the superintendent's office once. The superintendent said, Simmons, have a seat. Sat down. It seems you was on a train, such a train, such and such a date. And a person noticed and said that you was neat, you was courteous, but you didn't smile enough. So I explained to him and said, well, I didn't know I had to smile all the time.
Porters earned less than anyone in the railroad business. In 1920, they were expected to work 100 hours every week for roughly 15 cents per hour.
Porters, by modern standards, were exploited horribly by the Pullman Company. They were paid a flat wage, which was dependent upon a willingness to work 24 or 36 or 48 hours continuously without a break.
Because the porters received tips from passengers, the Pullman executives justified the low pay. They believed tips would encourage the porters' job performance. If porters wanted a raise or had a grievance, they were referred to the Pullman Company Union. Many porters worried if they voiced their complaints to the company union, they'd be fired. For 25 years, the porters had tried unsuccessfully to organize their own union. Finally, in 1925, they founded the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. The union members asked an outspoken magazine editor named A. Philip Randolph to be president. A. Philip Randolph was considered by many to be a communist. The son of a minister, Randolph moved from Jacksonville, Florida to Harlem in 1911. There he studied the ideas of Karl Marx and spoke of his beliefs in the socialist movement. In 1917, he founded the controversial magazine, The Messenger. The Messenger promoted itself as the only radical Negro magazine in America. Randolph accepted the union's offer to be president. He voiced the porters' complaints in his magazine and traveled around the country speaking to porters about the benefits of joining the new union.
I consider the fight for the Negro masses the greatest service I can render my people, and the fight alone is my complete compensation. A. Philip Randolph.
He's subject to a tremendous amount of hostility and criticism by nearly every segment of the American population because he's actively and aggressively promoting equality for blacks, which represents a threat to the established white order.
For years, the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters struggled to be recognized by the Pullman Company.
During that time, they had to operate in secrecy. Hundreds of porters were fired for affiliation with the union. They brought in Filipinos for a while as a threat to the porters' jobs. Porters were beat up. Pullman tried every trick in the book, including all of the legal maneuvers.
Porters were forced to hold secret union meetings. They sometimes passed union messages on trains. If something was important, porters across the country heard about it in a day. Legend has it that the Pullman Company even tried to bribe A. Philip Randolph. They sent him a blank check, which he could fill out for any amount he desired. Randolph refused the check. He could not be bought. In 1932, with the election of Franklin Roosevelt, the future of the Porters Union turned positive. President Roosevelt persuaded Congress to amend the Railway Labor Act to include sleeping car porters and attendants. This forced the Pullman Company to finally recognize the Porters Union. For 12 years, the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters had fought to be acknowledged by the Pullman Company. Now, for the first time in American history, a major corporation had agreed to negotiate a labor contract with the Union of Black Workers. On August 25, 1937, after 6 months of negotiations, the Pullman Company finally signed a labor contract with the union.
Not only was it a cause for the Pullman porters, but the entire black race was watching this. When he won over Pullman, which was the epitome of white society, that was a tremendous shot in the arm for all African-American people, not just labor.
The Pullman Company agreed to many of the porters' demands, including increased wages, reductions of the 100-hour week to 60 hours, and allowing 4 hours of sleep while working on overnight trains.
I went to work for the Pullman Company, 50 cents an hour in 1943. We got a raise about 5 months later, and we raised from 50 cents an hour to 60 cents an hour. So at one of the meetings, Mr. A. Philip Randolph, who was our international president, said that we should not be discouraged because the job didn't pay much, and maybe we wouldn't be treated too well. But if you stick with me, he told us, I'll have you making $1 an hour. Some of the porters laughed and said, take him to the side because he done lost his mind. Pullman Company would never pay you $1 an hour. But it came to pass.
A. Philip Randolph would spend his entire life pursuing better working conditions for Pullman porters and equal rights for African Americans. He eventually would be called the grandfather of the civil rights movement. The Pullman Company's battle with the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters would pale compared to the next battle, one that would threaten Pullman's monopoly on the sleeping car business. On December 7, 1941, America changed forever. With the bombing of Pearl Harbor, the United States declared war on Japan.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy.
Almost overnight, the entire country was mobilized. Millions of men and women said goodbye to loved ones and left on trains for unknown destinations. For most, the journey began the same way it would end, with the Pullman Company.
Nearly all troops traveling by train in the United States, any appreciable distance, traveled in Pullman cars. The Pullman Company was actually precluded from operating sleeping car service for civilians on some routes. First priority was given to military transportation.
Most servicemen traveled in luxury Pullman sleepers, but some were crammed into cars called troop sleepers. These were uncomfortable and crowded. On average, they slept 50% more people than the luxurious Pullman sleeping cars.
These were quite Spartan accommodations. They were very, very straightforward. Steel frame bunks, and instead of single upper and lower berths, bunks that were 3 and 4 high.
Troop sleepers were made with lightweight, rationed materials and fewer wheels. These passengers had a very rough ride. Pullman remained an integral part of the war effort for the entire length of the conflict. But during this time, the company was also fighting its own battle in a U.S. courtroom. The Pullman Company built, owned, and operated almost all the sleeping cars in the entire United States. Some railroads and manufacturers began to question the company's size. One competitor, Edward G. Budd of the Budd Company, complained to the U.S. Justice Department.
It's reasonable to believe that the 1940 antitrust action against the Pullman Company was inspired by the Budd Company's complaint that Pullman was intimidating the railroads to prevent the railroads from buying Budd-built sleeping cars. And Budd certainly felt that its ability to compete successfully in the broad and diverse passenger car market was jeopardized by the dominance of the Pullman Company.
In 1944, a U.S. court ruled that the company violated antitrust laws. The court ordered Pullman Incorporated to part with either its operation of passenger cars or its car manufacturing business. In 1947, the Pullman Company, which operated sleeping cars and parlor cars, was sold to a group of 57 railroads for $27 million.
The passengers really saw very little change in the way the sleeping cars were being operated. There still was a Pullman Company, this one owned by the railroads, but still employing the sleeping car porters, still maintaining the cars, still collecting the revenues.
By mid-century, the Pullman Company faced its biggest challenge yet. The company was losing much of the passenger business to the airline and automobile industry. In an effort to slow the losses, railroads attempted to modernize Pullman sleeping cars. Passengers traveling in Pullman cars in the 1950s had complete privacy. New Pullman sleeper cars featured rooms for each passenger.
Pullman manufactured cars with compartments or roomettes. They tried to put more compartments into a car by staggering them up and down along the corridor, and other innovations to simplify, perhaps economize, and make more appealing the passenger car, sleeping car services that were available to the public.
Despite these innovations, the Pullman Company was fighting a losing battle. By the 1960s, the Pullman Company was losing millions of dollars every year. some railroads stopped contracting with Pullman. They began to operate their own sleeping cars.
And by 1968, several of the major railroads operating sleeping cars through Pullman contracts decided that they were going to pull out. At that point, Pullman said that it could no longer efficiently provide a pool of sleepers for the remaining railroads that had contracts with them, and therefore recommended that all railroads that wanted to continue operating sleeping cars do so on their own.
On January 1st, 1969, the company which defined traveling in luxury ceased operating sleeping cars in the United States. For just over a century, the Pullman Company had provided passengers with opulent rail travel. It was the end of an era.
Well, the Pullman Company was a classic American industrial and commercial story. You have George Mortimer Pullman, a man who starts with nothing, gets involved in a number of business enterprises, and he's driven to succeed. He latches onto the sleeping car as a vehicle, no pun intended, for his aspirations. And systematically, very intelligently, sometimes ruthlessly, he forges a national system of sleeping car services, which is unrivaled in the world. He really creates from scratch a new American industry and a lifestyle, of something which has a profound effect on American popular culture. This grows and develops. It touches everybody, literally. Train passengers, people watching the trains go by. It influences the business community. It touches the African-American community in a profound way. It really shapes our image of the railroad that we carry with us today.
As Pullman cars rolled into history, they earned a special place in the hearts of passengers. Although the company is now part of the past, its contribution to the golden age of rail travel will never be forgotten. For millions, the word Pullman will always be equated with luxurious accommodations, first-class service, and a good night's sleep.
Now, from the History Channel, you can own the episode you've just seen of Trains Unlimited. Follow the rails that formed a nation and the mighty engines that make it run. Call 1-800-708-1776.